We had a really interesting discussion. So yeah, we started off looking at Wales Online um, website, and it was all about. Let me see if I can put it. Yeah, it was about building luxury homes that were going to be built in Cardiff, but actually they kept reporting on this, but they never appeared. So we're sort of looking, where is this sort of misinformation? Are they trying to mislead? And we looked at the fact that it was written by a trainee reporter, and then people were asking, well, could this be something that some developers are trying to push on? What was the source? Who? There may be other sources that are sort of trying to buy this and publicize it for their own purposes. So yeah, there was a lot of questioning around that, and we looked at an article from an RSPB magazine looked about that was talking about conservation strategies for birds. And we talked about how, when it comes from a charity, you might want to first trust it, but then others were saying, well, could this be just ways of trying to manipulate you in order to get money? Or, so there's quite some good discussions around, um, yeah, really around issues of trust. Can we trust the information that we receive? We talked about internet and getting news from YouTube and the different channels on that, and how it's really fantastic that those different sources that anybody can actually now present their channel, and that's really fantastic. But the downside to that is that they can say anything as well, and it may not be true. So we were talking about how people actually try to assess whether it's true or not, and there were some comments around the production and whether it looked sort of cheaply done, and whether people who were speaking seemed to be pushing particular views onto people or not. So yeah, and we talked also about Welsh news and news that is produced in both English and in Welsh, and whether there are differences between that. And there was sort of expressed the fact that there were sometimes slight differences between the content in English and in Welsh. So yeah, an interesting discussion.
And right, so the way in which you assessed it, I was interested in the bit there where you said you thought it um, uh, might not be. I think it might have been the homes bit, and then you said you had a look and you saw that it was a junior researcher. And how did you find that out?
Oh, it said it actually. It was transparent. It did say on the thing. It didn't even give the name of the reporter. It just said junior reporter or something like that.
Okay, right. Yeah, because it's difficult, isn't it, to find out whether something is genuine or not genuine. So I'm interested in how you talked with each other to see if you how you might assess it and see if you came up with anything. Great, thank you for group one. So group two, what did you talk about? I think group two, you were talking about the world, weren't you? Is it that the group?
Absolutely. We went global. So we had three news stories. One was the situation between China and Taiwan, and I suppose, and please, anyone in my group, tell me if I've got this wrong. This is slightly my interpretation of what we were saying. Is that we did have some of the facts, but obviously, what we hear a very Western view of this issue, and there is something about a story like this that you might think, well, it doesn't really affect us, or unless it's a terrible nuclear war, of course. And then we went on in complete contrast to this idea of having a tourist tax in Wales. And I think the issue here was really, is that a story that's kind of explored that allows a proper analysis of the pros and cons of that situation? And I suppose it's interesting, isn't it, comparing something like the China issue with something that's much more local, how how maybe it's easy for us to take a slightly more partisan view of something that's local, which I think ties into something that Ali was saying yesterday. And then the final issue, I know that, well, actually 4 issues, I've forgotten the other one, was the reporting of the assassination of a terrorist, in inverted commas, a Palestinian terrorist in the Middle East. And of course, this is a hugely controversial area, but also then how the use of language, is there something about that kind of steering our view on what the issue is? And then the final issue, which we touched on a bit, was Turkey selling drones to Russia. And then one of the issues that we thought, particularly with news that's, for want of a better word, foreign news, is there something that's easy for people to see in black and white, or the villains, you know, the good guys and the bad guys? So a whole kind of range of things there, and how sometimes it's really quite difficult to be absolutely clear about the information. And we talked a bit about how our response to this might be that echo chamber issue, but actually, in trying to explore it in any greater depth, we would need to spend all our life investigating the news. So
Yeah,
I don't know what.
There's a lot in there, isn't there? Because I was thinking, when you were talking, I was thinking, you've got, I think it might have been Ali predominantly, but the others sort of confirm this, that it's never quite black and white. I think Hugh sort of said something about the raining, didn't he? Sometimes there are some facts which are indisputable, if you like, but mainly a lot of what we look at in the news can be not quite so black and white, and there will be sort of shades in between there, won't there, in terms of what's true or not, and finding that out can be quite a challenge. Like you say, it could take you ages to find that out, and I think it's worth remembering as a group. The reason we're doing this exercise is to look at that and remember some of these challenges, so that when we go forward on Tuesday and a bit later today, we can start to think about how practically could we make a better difference in relation to that news. So there was that, and there was the other thing you said, reminded me, I think it was Shirish's point, where he was saying, let's not describe, I think I'm paraphrasing, who's doing what necessarily, just describing the people, but how do we get a better understanding of the issue? And I think Hugh said that as well, didn't he, when he was talking about putting the bringing these stories, making it about the stories, not the people, if you like, to help us have a better understanding of those issues. So yeah, well done. It's difficult because there's some chunky bits of news there, aren't there, which, like you say, could take you ages to really find out what's true or not. But you've got some along there which was sort of saying you felt they were possibly misleading, but not intentionally misleading, and some of those that you felt were okay, but none of those you felt were intentionally giving you information that was wrong. Is that right?
No, I don't think that we came to that conclusion. But just thinking about your point there, Sue, about the personalities, when we were talking about that issue about Turkey and Russia, it was about the personalities of Erdogan and Putin that came out there, not necessarily the kind of issue itself. So that was an interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a big issue for many years in terms of politics as well, hasn't it? Okay, thank you very much for that. What about group 3 then? What did you talk about?
We talked, it was generally, not too much international. There was something about the Vatican and 124 million, but it was a lot of the current anxieties over the condition of the NHS, for example, about paying direct debits for fuel bills, etc. So, you know, things that are preoccupying people at the moment. But what I found interesting was what people said in terms of how and why they trusted or didn't trust the news. And one thing that came up which I hadn't thought of, which actually I'll mention later. But there were a few things. Where one was people's first-hand knowledge and whether it resonated with them, what was being said in the news article. So with the NHS, for example, Barbara mentioned that her family work for the NHS, and that what was said within that resonated with her, or paying bills, and Bethany mentioned her experience of that. So it's that personal experience, and whether what's in the news actually it resonates in terms of people's personal experience. That was certainly something that came up. Also, interestingly, whether a piece of news had been heard or read or seen elsewhere. That tended to make people believe in it more. There was a really interesting thing which just came up by chance, because Barbara mentioned the thing that she mentioned was from Private Eye, the satirical magazine, and then Cheryl mentioned a local rag, not my words, which she found funny, which she often read because it was funny. So there's that thing about humor, and I hadn't thought about humor really. And of course, humor can be exaggerated, but it can reveal an inner truth, if you like. So there's that thing about how humor works, and in terms of its trustworthiness, and whether we accept that certain types of humor are exaggerations. On the other hand, as Bethany said, we might accept exaggeration in particular contexts, but sensationalism is something that we distrust, especially when it's obvious. So those are a few things that came up.
Yeah, it's interesting that personal, whether it personally resonates, because we saw a lot of that, didn't we, over COVID and in the Black Lives Matter movement. They're sort of big sort of national and global issues, aren't they? Which you might have got your news from very different sources. And I know from my own perspective, I used to like, when I used to read paper news, I would read a bit like Delith was saying yesterday. She would go and read the thing that was different to her, which she knew would have a very different stance to her position, and I would do the same. But when you get your news online now, it's all kind of, for me, you're always getting the same sort of news, so you have to sort of actively go and seek that out. So when you're online, a lot of the stuff might personally resonate because of the algorithms that they've got online that are trying to make it resonate with you as well, aren't there? So you've got that added dimension to try and navigate with news.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, great. So some really useful conversations there. Okay, so we've got quite a few examples amongst us then of different ways in which we get news, and we've had an opportunity to kind of look at those and how we might assess them or not be able to assess them. So it's probably a good time to just think, what do we want to note about that conversation for yourself? So you might just want to make some notes to yourself about things that, if we can't assess the news very well, then how might that be improved? To just keep a little note to yourself for later, as we can come back to this conversation a bit later. Are there Howell and Shirish spoke about the regulatory framework. Sometimes it's really easy to think, oh, well, we need better regulations, but then we also need people that will enforce those regulations. And I think one of the speakers was talking about that even though we've currently got regulations around the kind of more mainstream press, they're not always monitored perhaps as rigorously as we would like to think. So when we're talking later about ideas and ways in which we might want to improve this, just thinking about now, making a note to yourself, a little moment to think, are there any sort of initial thinking that you want to come back to when it comes to helping us to assess the news in the future, whether that be a platform or whether it's thinking about regulation or non-regulation? And just thinking more generally about, is there anything else that what do we want to remember about this conversation when it comes to thinking about how we might improve the way we sort of digest and receive and acknowledge our news?